Welcome back to Reign of Blood, the true story of the epic clash between the Aztec and Spanish empires. This is episode 6, and it is the first sidebar episode. And the goal of these is exactly what the name suggests, to pull out of the narrative a bit so we can focus on one very important aspect of the story for a relatively short period of time. Because numbering these episodes can be confusing and each podcast platform does numbering a little bit differently, we're just going to keep things simple and call this episode 6 instead of trying to name and number it separately to distinguish it from the narrative episodes. For this first sidebar, we're going to dig into the source material we have for the Conquest. In history, sources are everything, and they come in many forms. There are primary sources, of course, accounts of people who witnessed the events in question. These accounts are almost always biased, or worse, and even when they're not, you have to be careful when utilizing them to try to figure out the truth. Another important type of source material is archeology, which is the study of the past by way of objects and ruins and tombs that can be scientifically dated and attributed to particular periods. For cultures from the distant past without preserved writings for whatever reason, archaeology is invaluable to understanding their societies. But it's also valuable for the study of cultures that did preserve their writings because archaeology often proves or falsifies the histories that those cultures chose to record. While I myself was not personally part of any archaeological digs in central Mexico, there has been quite a bit of it done, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. And so we will be utilizing sources that highlight what this archaeology adds to the story. Then there are what we might call first-tier historical accounts that take all of the primary sources in archaeology available and prove or corroborate what they can and construct a narrative for the rest of us to try to understand. We are very fortunate to have all three of these types of source materials in relative abundance to draw on for our story. As is the case with most of history, the primary sources at our disposal, though vivid and copious, are hopelessly biased, as you might expect, and they contain many significant contradictions. We think it's important for you to know where we're getting our information from, and we want you to have access to that same information as well. When it comes to sources, we are lucky in a lot of ways because relatively reliable eyewitness or near eyewitness accounts survive from which we can construct this story. And historians have been able to come to a remarkable degree of certainty about how things unfolded. There are still some key controversial events and figures for which very important details are disputed. Either the sources don't agree, or what we know through archaeology and historical precedent makes certain versions unlikely. And each version of those events or interpretations of those characters has tremendous consequences. For the most part, though, historians have done a pretty good job working most of these conflicting narratives out, but we'll point out the ones that still linger as we encounter them. There's one eyewitness account that historians regard above all others, and that's the one written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, which we've already referenced and even quoted from in earlier episodes. It's the most highly regarded not because of its accuracy necessarily, but because it gives us a complete single narrative from one point of view that roughly corroborates with the timeline of events that's been largely established. It would be too much to say that Bernal Diaz's account has survived historical scrutiny all these years later because historians even today are revisiting his account and finding holes in it. But for better or for worse, his book, which he titled The Conquest of New Spain, is the foundational narrative of Cortez's expedition, and every book that came after relies on Bernal Diaz's account to some degree. Diaz was a soldier in Cortez's army, what we might recognize as a junior officer maybe, not part of Cortez's inner circle of decision makers and commanders, but just outside of that circle perhaps. And he served on previous and subsequent conquistador expeditions as well, so his perspective is fairly unique and fairly thorough. There were lots of conquistadors like Diaz who wrote accounts of the war with the Aztecs and other groups across Mexico in the ensuing decades. And they did this not to sell books, but to document what they did in order to obtain land or title or some other compensation from the Spanish crown. As you might imagine, most of these are quite self-aggrandizing, since their purpose was to impress the court officials reading them. Bernal Diaz del Castillo tells us that he had read some of these and or heard about them, and seems to have been angered by how people were taking credit for things they didn't do or had no part in, at least as far as he was concerned. He also goes out of his way to tell us that he's writing this at the end of his life, which was true. And so I think by that what he means is he's not seeking anything for his tale, like some of those other conquistadors were, except to set the record straight, and therefore his account should be seen as more credible and honest than those others. He also appears to have been upset to some degree by the way biographers of Cortés portrayed him as almost superhuman, and in the process this may have diminished or dismissed the heroism of the other soldiers that accompanied him and did most of the fighting. So late in his life, in the 1560s, on his estate in modern-day Guatemala, he decided to write his account of the conquest to, quote-unquote, set the record straight. So Diaz presents himself as someone who was well-positioned to see and recount all the major events of Cortés's expedition, and he provides riveting insight and opinions on all kinds of things, from the rivalries and factions within Cortés's army to the landscapes and the cities, to the decisive moments on their march to and conquest of the Mexica capital. It's not free of errors or bias or other faults by any means. For one thing, he wrote his account, or more likely dictated it to a scribe, years later, decades removed in fact from the events of the conquest. And for another, it is suspiciously similar to many other accounts that were written prior to his, accounts that he admitted to reading. And these similarities are especially suspicious when it comes to the actions that Moctezuma and other Aztecs took. Some historians have noted this, and they've done some real digging into the authenticity not only of his reporting, but of the man himself. And they've made the case that much, perhaps most of what he writes, he may not have actually witnessed. Instead, they suspect he pieced the narrative together from all those other letters and accounts that he claims to be refuting, and from maybe chatter that he may have recalled amongst the soldiers in Cortés's army, who could not and would not have been close enough to Cortés to have personally witnessed many of the events. The great 20th century Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes goes so far as to say that the Conquest of New Spain is the first great Latin American novel, meaning it's mostly fiction. Some modern historians even theorize that Cortés himself, or maybe someone on his behalf or his behest, may have written the Conquest of New Spain under Bernal Diaz de Castillo's name to give Cortés's version of events more credibility. This is a bit of a fringe theory, though one with some interesting connective tissue tying all the dots together. Nevertheless, for all its faults, the Conquest of New Spain remains, all these years later, the best jumping off point for trying to understand this chapter in history, particularly for the Western English-speaking or Spanish-speaking audience. Speaking of Cortés, he's the second primary source that we have, specifically his official letters. Now, we need to state right off the bat that these letters, 4 of them in total that are hundreds of pages each, are almost pure propaganda. And as an objective observer, Cortés falls well short, to put it mildly. His motives for these letters are not to serve as the authoritative journalistic account of the events. He's not trying to win a Pulitzer, in other words. Instead, he treats these letters like legal or at least political documents designed to associate everything he did, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with the interests of the king, and to make the case that he followed all the steps necessary under Castilian law to claim the lands for Spain, and, coincidentally I'm sure, that he was, as a consequence of those steps, the rightful governor of these new conquered lands, serving on behalf of the crown, of course. Also by sheer coincidence, the way he describes not only his moves and machinations, but all of Moctezuma's responses and reactions to those moves and machinations, all conveniently fit the narrative of an adversary who was properly and legally dispossessed of his territory. That's the primary purpose of Cortez's letters, and they all have this underlying subtext that's very rarely subtle. So, a lot going on with Cortez's version of events, and as you might expect, he paints himself in very favorable light. So you have to take his accounts with a ton of skepticism. All that said, we have to give some credit where credit is due. Cortez was a very prolific and skilled writer. He was a lawyer by training, and he wrote a lot like a lawyer. Very thorough, very meticulous, covering all the bases, at least as he saw it. And he also writes like he's charging by the word. And so these letters are incredibly extensive and descriptive, and he provides a ton of details about everything he sees, from the people to the landscape to the city to the villages and weapons and agricultural practices and all kinds of things. So as a description of the visuals and the textures of the world around him, it's fantastic. And because he's so meticulous, we get a detailed account of the sequence of events, as well as incredible insight into what Cortez was thinking during all the critical turning points, both in battles and in the equally important and interesting diplomatic engagements. Or at least what he wants us to think he was thinking. So even though we can't exactly take him at his word, particularly when it comes to his motives and his decision-making and his contextualizing of everything that happens, it's still an important and invaluable account. Comparatively little of the Aztec or Mayan versions of events has survived, mostly because the Spaniards destroyed most of what they found in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, especially anything that looked like writing or other records. They regarded native Mexican cultures as vile and inhumane and felt it was their duty to civilize them up to the standards of Christian European civilizations. First and foremost, these natives practiced human sacrifice, and that was a huge no-no. For another thing, they were pagans, and paganism was long the enemy of Christianity. The story of Christianity in late Roman and early medieval Europe was the slow but certain conversion of pagan societies, and anyone anywhere in the world who persisted with these cults of many gods were rejecting Christ, and would all end up in hell for eternity. From their vantage point, they wouldn't be very good Christians themselves if they allowed that to happen, and so their new native subjects needed to convert, forcibly if it came to that, and any remnants of their gods and their religion needed to be desecrated. And because they couldn't really tell, or didn't really much care, what the difference was between religious and non-religious writing and material, they just destroyed everything. What they couldn't destroy, however, were the oral histories of the native population, which have survived into our day, though we have to give this some context. Like pre-literate or even semi-literate societies all over the world throughout history, the Nahuatl-speaking people developed a highly refined oral tradition of stories and epic poems that were passed on from generation to generation. And that tradition continued after the conquest. We talked in a previous episode about how Aztec civilization didn't just disappear after the final defeat of Cuauhtémoc. This wasn't a situation where you have a final surrender of the Mexica-led armies and then suddenly everybody speaking Spanish and practicing Christianity. That process took decades or even centuries, and in the meantime, the language would endure, as would many of the traditions and institutions that the Aztecs had implemented over the last several hundred years, though all under the control of the new Spanish overlords. Not long after the final surrender of the Aztecs, the Valley of Mexico and the surrounding Nahuatl-speaking region transitioned from a military occupation run by conquistadors to a colonial enterprise run by crown offices and institutions and the church and its administrators. One of the primary concerns of the new colonial officers representing both church and state, besides the extracting of wealth, of course, was the conversion of all the crown's new indigenous subjects to Christianity. As we alluded to earlier, this was what, in their minds, justified the greed and the lust for gold and land and power. And for the church, converting the local population was the quickest and most secure way to insert their influence to ensure they had the same kind of power in the new Spanish American Empire that they did back in Spain. But more practically speaking, it was the best way to both pacify the natives and offer a degree of integration and therefore stability on the ground. Anything to help speed this process along was prioritized. This meant, first and foremost, teaching the Aztec peoples and other groups Spanish. And to that end, the Spanish priests who handled most of the educating at this time had to learn the indigenous languages, chiefly among them Nahuatl, which was by this time either a first or second language for most of the people in central Mexico. And to do this effectively and efficiently, they had to Latinize Nahuatl, meaning they had to give it a Latin-based alphabet, break down the grammar, etc. During this process, one Franciscan priest, Bernardino de Sahagún, had an idea. Instead of just learning the language as a foreign language, he thought it would be productive to learn about these people, their culture, their myths and legends, their history, and so on, and to record all of this in this new Latin rendering of their language. And so, in the middle of the 1500s, Sahagún and his native Nahua-speaking students went out into the cities and villages in the countryside and created this network of informants, as he called them. And they collected oral histories and transcribed them using the new Nahuatl alphabet. But that's not all he did. The Aztecs had developed their own hieroglyphics-based writing system prior to the Spanish arriving, and while it was very limited compared to the writing systems of other great civilizations of the time, it was sufficient for everything from cataloging inventories and broadcasting laws and rulings to communications between city officials and recording myths and legends. And though nearly all of that has been destroyed or otherwise lost to history, the tradition and the skill set of drawing these pictographs and hieroglyphics lived on for at least a few more generations after 1521. Sahagún went out and found people who were schooled in this tradition and got them to illustrate many of the scenes and episodes his informants described in this pictographic hieroglyphic style. Sahagún then compiled all of this into a massive 12-volume history, and he laid it out so that the Spanish and Nahuatl paragraphs were side by side. And they were accompanied by over 2,000 of those pictographic illustrations, giving us a kind of Rosetta Stone to decipher the Aztec language. Now, Sahagún wasn't exactly fascinated by the history of these people for its own sake. During the heights of the British Empire, by comparison, you have what they called Orientalists. These were officials and academics usually who were dispatched to India or China to fill one office or another. And over time, they became genuinely captivated by the culture and customs and the dress and the rituals and the women. Soon they started dressing like locals and eating like them and living in houses in their style, and they developed societies to better understand their conquered people. The pejorative term for this was called going native. Well, this wasn't that exactly. Sahagún's motives were purely practical and even a bit chauvinistic. He thought this kind of insight would help him and priests after him better understand the Aztec peoples in order to more easily and perhaps humanely convert and pacify them. So, not nothing from Sahagún here. A huge step compared to his contemporaries, but a saint he probably was not. Church authorities in Mexico were on board with Sahagún at first. Converting people was a good thing after all, and command of the local language had been a valuable missionary tool since the beginning of Christianity, as was an understanding of local customs, religions, and other traditions. Once bits and pieces of his work made its way to church officials in Santo Domingo and Madrid, however, the reaction was more, shall we say, mixed. Many saw Sahagún's work as too much of a celebration of Aztec culture and language, and they worried that it might slow or even reverse the conversion and integration of the natives by keeping their culture and their language alive somehow. They could use the text to teach themselves the new Latin alphabet for Nahuatl, perhaps, which ended up happening anyway. But whatever the reason, the Council of the Indies, which was the final ruling authority on all matters in the New World at this time, effectively canceled Sahagún's project. He was told, Thanks for the 25 years of fieldwork and translating and writing, but please hand over all your research and manuscripts and we'll take it from here. And by take it from here, they meant destroy it for all eternity. It appears Sahagun knew this outcome was likely, and in the final months of this project, he and his students worked furiously to copy the manuscript before he had to surrender his materials. And they were able to produce about 3 or 4 copies. At least 2 of these copies made their way to Europe, where they were subsequently buried in library archives and essentially forgotten about for more than 200 years. In fact, only a single manuscript survived into the 20th century, and it's known as the Florentine Codex. Florentine because it was discovered in the library of a private collector based in Florence, Italy in the late 1700s. Later, libraries and archives in Madrid found bits and pieces of another original manuscript, but the Florentine Codex is the most complete version. By the late 19th and early 20th century, scholars began traveling to Florence to study the Codex, and soon papers were being published about it. Few, if any, in the general public ever saw these publications, however, as their distributions were limited to academic circles and historical societies and the like. Slowly but surely, though, these papers would reignite interest in pre-Columbian cultures in general, and Nahuatl and Aztec subject matter in particular, at least in these academic circles. Now, these 12 volumes that Sahagun compiled are about everything from history to religious practices to politics and government and agriculture and trade and everything else that made up Aztec life. But one of the 12 volumes contains an account of the conquest that survived via these oral histories that were transmitted to Sahagun's Nahuatl-speaking informants. A Mexican anthropologist and historian by the name of Miguel León Portillo got his hands on a copy of the Florentine Codex, and specifically this volume, and he went on to synthesize its accounts with other letters and documents and codices discovered over time. And from all of this, he cobbled together a snapshot of how the Aztecs viewed their civilization on the eve of their encounter with the Spanish. And he even was able to piece together a narrative of sorts of the events of the conquest itself from the Aztec perspective. He published all of this in 1952 under the Spanish title Visión de los Vecinos, which means the vision of the vanquished. And later, the English translation appeared under the title Broken Spears. Both are still in print and easy to find online or in bookstores, and I cannot recommend them enough. Broken Spears is an extraordinary cultural achievement, and I don't want to discount it because we're going to be referring to it a lot. But it is not what we would call, from our 21st century perch, an authoritative source. Many key events and even characters are missing completely. There's no mention of the Tlaxcala, for example. And lots of the details and the sequence of events are contradicted by both the Spanish accounts and the archaeological record. Also, these are taken directly from the oral histories, and so not only are they technically hearsay, going back multiple degrees, meaning they're what someone heard from someone who might have been in the room when a particular topic was being discussed or a decision was being made. And on top of that, they're written, or at least recorded, in a way that sounds like a storyteller entertaining people around a fire. Not like a historian or a journalist even trying to record events for posterity. And so when you read Broken Spears, it comes across much more like an epic poem with omens and supernatural phenomena woven into the story, and less like a historical account of facts and dates and character decisions and the like that we're used to. Again, this isn't to knock the Aztecs. Civilizations all over the world and all throughout history produced stories like this that served as their official histories. The Bible is full of stories where history and religion blend and the laws of physics and logic seem not to exist. Same with the Hindu Vedas of South Asia. Same with the Odyssey and the Iliad of ancient Greece. Same with the medieval stories of Beowulf or King Arthur or Robin Hood or St. James, who is said to have slayed a dragon. In all of these stories, we have myth and history overlapping to a large degree to tell a larger story about a people or an event. The narrative captured by Broken Spears fits nicely into this tradition, But even though we can't treat it like an authoritative historical source as we understand that to be today, Broken Spears does two things that are invaluable. First, it paints a vivid picture of the culture and the worldview of the Aztec peoples, especially the Triple Alliance of the Mexica, the Tepanecs, and the Acolhua, and it helps us better understand how they spoke and how they thought. In other words, it literally gives them a voice, something the Spanish denied them for over 400 years, and it gives us a window into their minds. The second thing it does is it puts us in the room, or at least near the room, as the Mexica and their allies are learning about these events, and we get to see how they did their best to analyze them and reconcile them with their understanding of the world and their prophecies and superstitions, and how all of that informed how they ultimately reacted to these events. So those are the primary sources, and I encourage you all to seek these out yourselves. There are some additional sources we use for Reign of Blood, and I want to talk quickly about those. First is a textbook called simply The Aztecs by Michael E. Smith. I use the 3rd edition published in 2012, and so it incorporates many of the latest archaeological discoveries and theories around those discoveries. Smith provides a short account of the conquest at the end, but its real value is its thorough examination of Aztec history and culture, and it's not short on details. Everything from religion to the economy to the architecture and education to their calendar, everything is meticulously described. It's a bit academic, as you would expect from a textbook, but it provides as complete a picture of Aztec history and society as you'll find in one volume. There have been multiple books written about the Spanish and the Aztecs over the decades, many in English, though many more in Spanish, and some very recently. The godfather of English language histories on the topic was William H. Prescott, who wrote The Conquest of Mexico in 1843. And it's still considered the classic on the subject, though it's pretty dated in terms of its writing style. More recently, there are two books that I can recommend. The first is When Cortés Met Montezuma by Matthew Restall, published in 2018. And it's a detailed account of the build-up to and immediate aftermath of the critical first encounter of the two leaders on one of the outer islands of Tenochtitlan. Restall also does a much more thorough examination of the authenticity of the sources and the actors than I do here. All in all, it's just a great modern rendering of this 500-year-old story. The other book I can recommend is called Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs by Camilla Townsend, who builds off the foundation of Broken Spears and combines it with new archaeological evidence to construct what is essentially the first truly Aztec account of the conquest. All of the books I mentioned can be found on Amazon or other online booksellers. Many are available as audiobooks or digital downloads as well, and we'll be sure to put links to them on the website, www.intellectualbrutality.com. So that's it for this first sidebar. In the next episode, episode 7, we'll pick up the narrative with Cortés getting the appointment of a lifetime from Diego Velázquez, while the Aztec emperor struggles to reconcile rumors of strange people arriving from the east with ominous omens appearing around him. Episode 7 will be out soon.